Good evening and welcome to Cross-Examination. Tonight we're tackling a question that sits at the very heart of our educational system. For decades, standardized tests have been a cornerstone of education, acting as gatekeepers for university admissions and tools for measuring student progress. But the central debate continues to rage. Do they truly measure intelligence? Or do they merely assess a very narrow and specific set of skills? To explore this complex issue, we're joined by two distinguished guests. Dr. David Miller is an educational psychologist and a firm proponent of the utility and objectivity of these tests. Welcome, Dr. Miller.
Thank you for having me, Sarah. It's a vital conversation.
And offering a counter perspective is Ms. Elena Vance, a veteran high school principal who believes these tests are a flawed and inequitable measure of a student's potential. Welcome, Ms. Vance.
I'm glad to be here to share my experiences from the front lines of education.
Our format tonight will begin with opening statements from each of our guests, followed by a moderated discussion. And we'll conclude with their final remarks. We'll start with you, Dr. Miller.
Thank you. Let me be clear from the outset. No one claims that standardized tests are a perfect instrument. They're not a magical window into the soul or a complete measure of a person's worth. However, they're undeniably the most reliable, objective, and fair tool we currently possess for measuring crucial cognitive skills on a large societal scale. My first point centers on objectivity and fairness. In an ideal world, every teacher's grade would mean the same thing. But we don't live in that world. Grade inflation is a documented phenomenon, and unconscious bias, however unintentional, can influence how a teacher evaluates a student. Standardized tests provide a common, consistent benchmark. They ensure that every student, whether from a wealthy suburb or an under-resourced rural area, is evaluated using the exact same criteria, creating a genuinely level playing field. Secondly, we must consider their predictive validity. Extensive research has shown a strong positive correlation between scores on tests like the SAT or ACT and future academic success. This includes first-year university GPA, likelihood of graduating, and even performance in graduate-level programs. This is because these tests measure skills that are absolutely essential for high-level study. I'm talking about logical reasoning, the ability to comprehend complex texts, and quantitative analysis. These aren't trivial skills. They're the bedrock of academic and professional competence. Finally, there's the critical issue of system-level accountability. How can we know if our educational policies are working? How do we identify schools or entire districts that are failing their students? Standardized test data is the most powerful diagnostic tool we have for this purpose. It allows governments and administrators to allocate resources effectively, target interventions where they're most needed, and track progress over time. Without this objective data, we'd be flying blind, and the students most in need of help would be the ones to suffer. Therefore, while we should always seek to improve them, we must view these tests not as an enemy, but as a necessary instrument for maintaining high academic standards and promoting a true meritocracy.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Ms. Vance, your opening statement.
Thank you, Sarah. Dr. Miller speaks of fairness and objectivity, but from my perspective as a principal who sees the real-world impact every day, standardized tests are a dangerously narrow and often biased measure. They actively stifle genuine learning, they promote systemic inequality, and they utterly fail to capture the diverse and wonderful spectrum of human intelligence. My primary objection is their narrow definition of intelligence. These tests don't measure a student's curiosity, their resilience in the face of failure, or their ability to collaborate on a complex problem. They don't assess creativity, leadership, or emotional intelligence. Instead, they primarily measure a student's ability to recall memorized information and perform well under intense, artificial pressure. These aren't the skills that'll solve the complex challenges of the 21st century. We're testing for yesterday's competencies, while ignoring the ones that matter for tomorrow. Next, let's talk about the myth of the level playing field. These tests are inherently biased. The language, the context of the questions, and the assumed background knowledge are often framed in a way that's far more familiar to students from affluent, dominant culture backgrounds. Furthermore, the so-called testing gap between wealthy and low-income students isn't an intelligence gap. It's an opportunity gap. It reflects the vast disparity in access to resources like expensive private tutoring, test prep courses, and even the quiet, stable home environments needed for focused study. Finally, and perhaps most destructively, is the negative impact on education itself. I see it every year. We call it teaching to the test. When a school's funding or a teacher's job depends on test scores, the curriculum inevitably narrows. Wonderful subjects like art, music, and even history and science get pushed aside to make more time for test-taking strategies and drills. Learning becomes a chore, a means to an end, rather than a joyful process of discovery. The immense stress and anxiety these high-stakes tests place on students and educators is toxic. We're burning out our children and our teachers in the pursuit of a single number. It's time to demand a more holistic, humane, and authentic way of recognizing the potential within every single student.
Thank you both for those comprehensive opening statements. Let's move into our discussion. Ms. Vance, I'd like to start with you. Dr. Miller makes a compelling point about objectivity. He argues that tests are a crucial tool for removing potential teacher bias, or the inconsistencies of grade inflation. Without a common yardstick, how can you possibly ensure fairness across an entire country?
That's a fair question, and I appreciate the intention behind the search for objectivity. However, the current system doesn't remove bias. It simply replaces individual, localized bias with a far more damaging systemic bias. A test written by a committee far removed from the classroom will always contain cultural blind spots. True fairness comes from building better, more reliable systems of local assessment. This can be done through moderated portfolios of student work, where teachers from different schools collaborate to standardize their grading against a common, detailed rubric. It also involves performance-based assessments and capstone projects that can be judged on multiple, clearly defined criteria. It requires more investment in professional development for teachers, but it creates a richer, more authentic picture of student achievement without sacrificing rigor.
Dr. Miller, how do you respond to that? Could moderated portfolios be a viable alternative?
While portfolios and project-based work are wonderful components of a rich education, the idea that they can be implemented as a primary assessment tool on a national scale is, frankly, unworkable. The logistical and financial challenges would be immense. More importantly, you reintroduce the very subjectivity we seek to eliminate. How do you compare a portfolio from a well-funded school with advanced facilities to one from a school that can't even afford basic art supplies? The standardized test, for all its faults, isolates cognitive skills from these environmental variables in a way that a portfolio simply cannot.
Let me turn to you then, Dr. Miller. Ms. Vance raised a very serious concern about the collateral damage of these tests, the immense stress on students, and the narrowing of the curriculum. How can the benefit of the data you collect justify these significant educational and emotional costs?
I don't dismiss the issue of student anxiety. It's a real and growing concern in all aspects of modern life, not just in testing. However, learning to perform under pressure and demonstrate competence is a part of life. We expect pilots, surgeons, and engineers to pass rigorous tests to prove their skills, and we should expect a degree of rigor in academia as well. More importantly, the argument about a narrowed curriculum is often a critique of poor implementation, not the test itself. A good education should provide the skills needed to do well on these tests, without, quote, teaching to the test, and the data's benefit is profound. That data shines a bright, uncomfortable light on the very inequities Ms. Vance speaks of. It identifies the schools where students of color or low-income students are being left behind, forcing districts to act. Without that data, those students would remain invisible.
But does that data truly lead to positive change, Ms. Vance? Or does it just lead to punishment for schools that are already struggling with a lack of resources?
Too often, it's the latter. The data is used as a hammer, not a flashlight. Schools are labeled as, quote, failing, without being given the necessary resources to improve. This creates a vicious cycle, where teachers are demoralized, student anxiety skyrockets, and the focus shifts entirely from education to remediation and test prep. The data doesn't fix the underlying poverty or lack of funding. It just documents the symptoms in a very stressful way.
Let's focus on solutions. Ms. Vance, if we were to eliminate standardized tests for high-stakes decisions like university admissions, what specific, scalable alternatives could handle the tens of thousands of applicants universities receive each year?
The answer is a comprehensive, holistic review model, which many universities are already moving towards. This isn't one single thing, but a collection of evidence. It includes a portfolio of the student's best work, a research paper, a creative project, a lab report. It includes detailed, structured teacher evaluations that speak to a student's intellectual curiosity and work ethic, not just a letter grade. It looks at long-term engagement in extracurriculars and community life. Yes, it's more resource-intensive, but it's an investment in making better, more informed decisions about the whole person.
Dr. Miller, you look skeptical. How do you respond to the persistent criticism, which Ms. Vance articulated earlier, of the socioeconomic and cultural bias baked into the design of these tests?
This is a criticism we in the field of psychometrics take extremely seriously. The process of developing a modern standardized test is incredibly rigorous and multi-layered. Every single question is piloted and analyzed for differential item functioning, which is a statistical method to detect if a question unfairly favors one group over another, be it gender, race, or socioeconomic status. Questions that show bias are revised or thrown out entirely. Diverse panels of educators and community members review the tests to identify and eliminate cultural blind spots. Is the process perfect? No. But it's a far more scientific and deliberate effort to achieve fairness than a subjective portfolio review would be.
We've reached the point for closing statements. Each of you will have a final moment to summarize your position. Ms. Vance, you may begin.
We stand at a crossroads in education. We can continue down a path that reduces our students to a single test score, a path that we know favors the privileged, narrows what we value in our classrooms, and damages the mental health of our children and teachers. Or, we can choose a better way. We can choose to see our students as whole people, rich with talents that cannot be captured on a bubble sheet. We must move beyond a system that values test-taking prowess over a student's curiosity, their creativity, and their character. It's time for us to embrace a more humane, a more authentic, and ultimately a more effective vision of what education can and should be.
Thank you. Dr. Miller, your closing statement.
The desire for a holistic approach is understandable, but we mustn't sacrifice objectivity at its altar. In a large, diverse, and complex society, we need reliable, impartial data to ensure every child has a fair chance at a quality education. Standardized tests provide that data. They hold our systems accountable for serving all students. They have strong predictive value for future success, and they remain the most effective tool we have for making fair comparisons on a broad scale. The challenges they present aren't reasons to abandon them, but reasons to improve them, and to improve how we use their results. For all their difficulties, these tests remain our most powerful instrument for upholding high standards and promoting genuine equity in education.
Thank you, Dr. David Miller and Ms. Elena Vance, for a robust and deeply insightful debate tonight. You've clearly framed this central conflict: the pragmatic need for objective, scalable data on one side, and the passionate call for a more holistic, individualized, and less stressful approach to student evaluation on the other. The question for all of us to consider is this: In our quest to measure potential, what are we truly valuing, and what might we be leaving behind? Thank you for watching. Good evening.